Starmer versus SAS veterans legal threat. Keir Starmer just told SAS veterans not to worry about vexatious prosecutions after Labour repealed legislation that was supposed to protect them, and the veterans' response was essentially, "Thanks for nothing, we're suing you anyway." The SAS Regimental Association, which represents some of the most elite soldiers Britain has ever produced, is threatening judicial review because they think Starmer's either been poorly briefed or is deliberately ignoring warnings from people who actually understand what serving in Northern Ireland meant. And when 8 retired 4-star generals, an Air Chief Marshal, and the SAS itself are telling you your legislation is dangerous nonsense, maybe it's worth considering they might know something you don't. So buckle up, because we're about to dissect why veterans who fought terrorists during the Troubles don't trust Labour's promises about protection. But before we proceed, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more updates on the UK political insight. Thank you. Why the SAS Regimental Association thinks Starmer's legislation profoundly damages Britain's defenses, and whether a prime minister who's never served in uniform can possibly understand what he's asking of those who did. This is where Labour's ideological commitment to human rights law crashes headfirst into the reality of counterterrorism operations, and the people who risk their lives don't think Starmer's got the balance right. Right, let's start with what actually changed, because the context is crucial. The Conservative government passed the Legacy Act, which provided conditional immunity for anyone who cooperated with investigations into Troubles-era killings. It banned inquests and civil actions connected to events during the Troubles. The idea was to draw a line under decades-old events and protect veterans who served during that period from endless legal harassment for actions they took fighting terrorism. Labour campaigned against the Legacy Act, calling it an amnesty for terrorists and saying it denied justice to victims' families. They promised to repeal it, which they've now done, replacing it with a commission to investigate Troubles-related killings. At least 9 inquests are expected to restart as a result, which means cases that had been closed will reopen, and veterans who thought they'd moved past that chapter of their lives are now facing potential prosecution decades later. Starmer's position, stated as he traveled to the G20 in South Africa, is that veterans shouldn't worry because the new legislation carefully sets out the balance that was be struck with particular protections in place, and he says he's absolutely confident there will be no vexatious prosecutions and that they've got the right balance. That's a politician speaking in generalities that sound reassuring, but don't actually address specific concerns about how the system will work in practice. The SAS Regimental Association's response is absolutely scathing in its dismissal of those assurances. They suggest Starmer has either been poorly briefed or is determined to accept without question a deeply flawed plan from the Northern Ireland office. That's not subtle criticism. That's essentially calling the Prime Minister either ignorant or willfully blind to obvious problems that everyone else can see. Their key argument is devastating. When so many highly experienced, well-informed, shrewd, and long-term observers conclude with one accord that regardless of assertions, the proposed legislation fails to protect veterans, then it behooves the PM to sit up and listen. They're saying that unanimous expert opinion from people who actually know what they're talking about is being ignored in favor of political convenience or ideological commitment. The phrase, "the first duty of government is the defense of the realm," cuts to the heart of their concern. They're arguing that by exposing veterans to potential prosecution, Labour is making it harder to recruit and retain soldiers willing to serve in difficult operational environments. If you know that decades later you might face legal action for decisions made in combat against terrorists, why would you volunteer for that role? How does that strengthen Britain's defenses when the international landscape is darkening? Simon Barry, former lieutenant colonel with the Parachute Regiment, brings another dimension with his comment that the veteran and RUC community do not believe Starmer's assurances regardless of what the PM and his party claim. The Royal Ulster Constabulary served alongside military forces during the Troubles, facing the same terrorism threats and making the same difficult decisions. If neither veterans nor former police trust the protections Labour claims exist, that suggests the gap between government promises and operational reality is enormous. Barry's point about the Republic of Ireland's involvement being a betrayal of both the IRA victims and our national sovereignty raises questions about whether British personnel should face investigation or prosecution influenced by another nation's involvement, particularly when that nation was where many IRA operatives found sanctuary during the Troubles. That's not just about legal process, it's about sovereignty and who gets to judge British service personnel's actions. The threat of judicial review from the SAS Regimental Association isn't symbolic. These aren't people making empty threats. They're serious about challenging this legislation in court. And given their resources, expertise, and the public support they're likely to command, that legal challenge could be significant and embarrassing for the government, even if it ultimately fails. Marc Francois' question during PMQs was particularly pointed. The PM may be an experienced lawyer, but he has never been a soldier. So how can he possibly think he knows more about caring for veterans and protecting their interests than 8 retired 4-star generals, 1 Air Chief Marshal, and the SAS itself are telling you your legislation is dangerous nonsense? That's not just about credentials, it's about experiential knowledge that no amount of legal training can substitute for. Starmer's legal background actually works against him here because it makes him appear to be approaching this as an abstract question of balancing competing legal principles rather than understanding the operational reality of counterterrorism work. Veterans aren't worried about theoretical legal protections, they're worried about prosecutors with political agendas using vague standards to go after them decades after events when memories have faded and evidence is incomplete. The concern about vexatious prosecutions is that even if charges ultimately don't stick, the process of being investigated and potentially prosecuted is punishment itself. Legal costs, reputational damage, psychological stress, all of that happens regardless of whether you're eventually cleared. And if you're a veteran in your 60s or 70s being investigated for actions you took in your 20s fighting terrorism, that process can be devastating, even without conviction. The fact that the Conservative Legacy Act was ruled to breach the European Convention on Human Rights adds complexity, because it suggests any protection robust enough to actually shield veterans will face legal challenges on human rights grounds. Labor's approach tries to thread the needle by providing some protections while satisfying ECHR requirements, but veterans definitely don't think that balance works in practice. The political parties in Northern Ireland opposing the Tory legislation suggests it wasn't popular locally. But that doesn't necessarily mean Labor's replacement is better. It might just mean that any approach that doesn't result in prosecuting security forces will face opposition from those who want accountability, regardless of operational context or time past. At least 9 inquests restarting means 9 families will get opportunities to seek answers about loved ones' deaths, which from one perspective is justice delayed but not denied. From another perspective, it's reopening wounds and potentially prosecuting people for actions taken in good faith fighting terrorism decades ago when rules of engagement and operational circumstances were different. The question of whether soldiers who served during the Troubles should face prosecution is genuinely difficult because it involves competing moral and legal claims. Victims' families deserve answers and justice. But soldiers who served in incredibly difficult circumstances, often against terrorists who didn't follow any rules, deserve protection from politically motivated prosecutions decades later when context has been lost and memories have faded.